Thank you. Thank you, Shep. Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for introducing me to Bill Lewis, who's made the Northshire Bookstore, as far as I can tell, the epicenter of support and sales of Into Dust and Fire in the entire United States. Thank you to C-SPAN BookTV for making me feel like Oprah Winfrey, if only for an hour. And it's wonderful to be here. Isn't this everything that a bookstore should be? Really, I'm thrilled to be at the Northshire. I'm also happy to be in Vermont because I have long-standing family ties with the state. Can you hear? Yeah, talk louder. Okay. I have long-standing ties with the state, and my book really got started here in Vermont. When I was a little girl, I used to spend my school vacations with my grandmother, who lived in a wonderful big old white federal-style house on Main Street in Windsor, Vermont, which is an hour and a half maybe north of here and on the Connecticut River. I could spend the summers what she called lolling around, reading and imagining what it was like to live there before I was born. My father had a big family. There were 7 children. He had 2 sisters and 4 brothers. The most famous of them would be Archibald Cox, who you probably remember was the Watergate special prosecutor. But when I was growing up, my father's brother, who really fascinated me, was the one who was missing from the family. He'd been killed in the war, which at that time, of course, was World War II. My grandmother kept mementos of his around the house. I knew a few things from them. She didn't talk about him much. She was kind of reticent about anything very private anyway. She kept a wonderful photograph in her bedroom that showed him in the round, flat helmet of a British soldier. It framed his face like a halo almost. I thought, could anyone have been more heroic and handsome than my Uncle Rob? I knew that he'd been athletic. She had a photograph of him in his hockey skates and his prep school sweater. He'd gone to St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, which was the first, really the archetype of these Spartan Episcopalian boys' boarding schools in New England. I knew he'd done very well there. She kept his trophies in the dining room, and one of them was known as modestly as the Best Boy Medal for outstanding diligence and virtue, which he had won his senior year. From family stories, I knew that he had been killed in Tunisia in 1943. I knew that he'd fought for the British, not the Americans, and I knew he had gone ahead of America as a whole. Well, I grew up. I became a journalist. I lived through the war in Vietnam, which raised a lot of interesting questions about war and its value. As I say, I became a journalist, and about 6 years ago, I was casting around for book idea, and it occurred to me maybe I should just poke around a little and see what I can learn about my uncle. Was he really as heroic as he had looked to me when I was a child? So I did. I got in touch. The first person I got in touch with was an old family friend named Charles McLean, who was a retired professor at Dartmouth. And to my astonishment, I discovered that he had actually spent the day with my uncle on the very day Uncle Robbie decided to go to war. It was May 31, 1941. They were both seniors in college, my uncle at Harvard and Charles McLean at Dartmouth. They met up at St. Paul's for what was that school's rather self-important equivalent of what they call homecoming at other schools that involved straw boaters and boat club blazers and lots of crew races. But at that point, at the end of May in 1941, what was really foremost on most people's minds was what was happening in Europe. Of course, Hitler had ridden roughshod over almost all of it. And the draft had been reinstated in the United States. So most of the people who were about to graduate from college, like my uncle, were very concerned about what would happen next. Would they be drafted? Did they want to join the war? College campuses at that point were really embroiled in controversy, much as college campuses were when I was in school. There was the isolationists who wanted America to stay out, the interventionists who believed that America should be in. All this was on my uncle's mind, and he had learned at college about an opportunity to join the British Army as an officer candidate in a rather, what they called a smart regiment in England called the King's Royal Rifle Corps. It had actually first been started in the colonies, in the American colonies, in the 1750s during the French and Indian War. They'd wanted to bring in some colonists who knew something about the landscape and could help fight the Indians and the French. Of course, when the American Revolution came, there were no more colonists in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. But in 1941, when the British were desperate to get the United States involved in the war, a few great minds in England, such as the Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, had done what they could to make arrangements to bring what would ultimately be 18 Americans to join the King's Royal Rifle Corps. My uncle and another fellow from Harvard named Hayward Cutting would be two of the first to join. Now, that night, when he was spending the evening with Charles McLean, he tried to convince McLean to go with him. They talked over the pros and cons. By the end of the evening, when my uncle went back to Cambridge, he'd made up his mind for sure to go. Charles McLean wasn't quite so sure what he would do, but he headed back to Dartmouth to talk over the idea with some of his close friends who were very committed interventionists, leaders really of the interventionist movement at Dartmouth. So to start, I'd like to read a little bit about what happened that night as Charles McLean left my uncle in New Hampshire, and a little bit about what happened almost 70 years later when I met with McLean in his small room in Hanover as a much older man. Excited, McLean raced through the dark back to Hanover and the stolid brick Honor Society house beside the village green. Locating Bolte and Dirk, these were his friends, took a matter of minutes. The members all slept in rows of beds under the eaves at the Cask and Gauntlet in a chilly open attic they called the wind tunnel. No sooner had they comprehended the news than they rushed off to find Brister and his roommate, Tom Littlefield, who shared an apartment on Main Street. More discussion and debate among the Dartmouth friends would follow. Within weeks, their applications to the 60th Rifles, which was another name for the King's Royal Rifle Corps, would be received and approved. Tom Littlefield, who wanted to go too, was rejected on account of a bum shoulder. But that night, May 31, 1941, the die was cast. Cox, Cutting, Brister, Durkee, and Bolte would offer themselves to become British soldiers, officer candidates in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. In less than 6 weeks, they would ship out for England. Other Harvard and Dartmouth men would follow. 18 Americans in all joined the 60th Rifles. And some 17 months later, the U.S. Army itself finally would enter the fray. But these 5 young men went first, and in war, timing truly is everything. Before going to sleep that night, this is when I talked with him 70 years later, Charles McLean, as was his habit, wrote in his diary, 65 years later, in the small book-lined rooms where he lived alone at a Hanover, New Hampshire retirement village, he showed me the entry. It seemed to have surprised him. Fear was not a viable thought or emotion during those days, he mused. Cox, he had written in 1941, has started me thinking. He wants me to go with him. The idea is very attractive. It is clean, no waiting, exciting. But I am dubious of the chance of coming back. Well, I knew a good quote when I heard one, even though it sort of gave me the shivers that he had so neatly foreseen the situation. So I asked Charles McLean to put me in touch with the descendants and relatives of the other 4 men who went, and he did, and they produced amazing piles of journals, letters, reminiscences. The sister of Charles Bolte was still alive. I was able to interview her, and it became clearer and clearer that this was a story that really needed to be told and that I thought at the time wouldn't be too difficult to tell. Turned out to be a little harder than I expected, but In any case,